All right, guys, this is going to be section 2 of Silly Salmon. I'm going to be honest, this is a pretty long one. So if you just, when you do these videos, you don't have to get all the way through the video in one setting. Just maybe when you stop, just pause, look at the timestamp, like look at what time it is in the video, and then just go back to that spot, okay? I'm just doing it in these sections to align with what the actual presentation does, so that if you know what section you're on in the presentation, you would know what video to watch in case you wanted to kind of work with both a little bit, okay? All right, so the first thing we're going to do here is we have our salmon set up, we've got our lane set up. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add touch controls and make it so the salmon will move from lane to lane. Now, this is actually a lot more complicated than you would think. So some of the code we do in here is going to seem like maybe a little confusing, but as we put it in, I will explain it and it should make more sense, okay? The first thing we need to do is we actually have to add the touch controls object. So this is similar to like adding a keyboard or a mouse to a game so that we know we can program with it. So I'm just going to double click out here. And instead of adding like a sprite or whatever, I would add something called touch. So if we just add that in. So this touch, it's not like a physical sprite that you see. It just is, it's a control mechanism, right? So it's like a keyboard. So you'll see it here in the object window on the right, but it's not something you drag onto your layout or anything. It just means now that when we go into our event sheet, we can program events for the touch controls. Okay. So let's do that. Let's go to our event sheet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a new group. So we're going to right click and we're going to add a group. We're going to call it touch controls. Now, if you haven't felt it yet, this game will definitely show you why it's important to organize because there's going to be huge chunks of code and we really need it organized really well so that we can go back and find what we need to do. The other thing we're going to be doing in this game is making comments. And comments are basically like notes, and we're going to write notes on our event sheet to help us remember what different parts of the code do because it will be kind of confusing, especially if you don't really get the code right away. But at least we can write notes that will simplify it and you can say, yep, this is what this does, and it'll be really easy. All right, so we have our group called touch controls. Then what we're going to do is we are going to make our first touch event. So we're going to add an event to touch controls. We're going to use touch, okay? And we want to do something called, it's called on nth touch start. So I'm just going to say on and then nt. Okay, so it's this right here. Well, basically what this is where this is how we tell it to record when a touch begins. And it says up here, like when you click on this, it gives you a note. So this triggers when a touch input begins. That's what on nth touch start means. Okay, so we're going to put that in. Okay, and the touch number can just be 0. Okay, so when you put this in, it should say touch on touch 0 start. This is basically saying that we're beginning a touch. Okay. Then what we're going to do is remember on the salmon, we made those instance variables. I'll just click on them quick here. So we have like this touch X start, touch X end, touch Y start, and touch Y end. So basically what we're going to do is when we start a touch, we are going to link up his touch, his starting variables to this. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an action here for salmon. We're going to set value. I would type it in. So set value. We're going to change this and we're going to set the value of touch X start. And what we're going to do for the value is we're going to set it to the word touch. And you want to like press enter or click on the suggestion. We're going to do dot and we're going to do absolute X. Okay. So let me get a couple of these in and then I'll explain what this actually means. So let's do another one. So we're going to do the same thing for touch Y. So we're going to add an action for salmon. We're going to set value. And we're going to do touch Y start. And then we're going to set that to touch dot absolute Y. Absolute Y. Okay. So basically when we initiate a touch, the computer is recording that X and Y coordinate. So all that we're doing is we're saying we're going to set the salmon's touch X variable to match that starting X position. So touch dot absolute X means that's the X position of our beginning touch. And then this touch dot absolute Y is the beginning of our Y coordinate. So essentially what this event is doing, it's taking the actual X and Y coordinate of the touch and it's setting the variables of the salmon to match that. Okay, that's all that that's doing. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to make a global variable. So just out here in the empty space, we're going to right click and we're going to add a global variable. And this variable is going to be called game over. And the initial value will be 0. All that we're going to use this variable for is basically to turn the game on and off. So what we're going to do is some events will have a condition that says game over has to be 0 for it to work. And what we'll do is when the salmon dies, we're going to just toggle this variable to 1. And that way, any event where the game over had to be 0 will no longer work. Okay, so that way, like when you hit a game over, you can't make the salmon move around. Like we're going to tie some of the movement to this so that you can't like control the salmon anymore once we end the game. So that's what this global variable is going to be for. Okay, so let's make another event. The reason why we add this variable now is because we're going to use it. So we're going to add another event to touch controls. So just click on that. And we're just going to do system, compare variable. And we want game over to equal to 0. Okay. Now what we're going to do is literally all of the touch events are going to be sub-events of this game over equals 0, which means that they're only going to work when the variable equals 0. So essentially, by having this as a condition on top of everything else, basically we can very easily switch all of this code on and off. So basically when the salmon dies, we're going to toggle this to 1, and anything that is a sub-event of this will no longer work. So that's essentially why we're doing it this way. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a sub-event to game over 0. So I'm going to right-click here on this empty space, add a sub-event, and we're going to do touch, and we're going to do on nth end. So let's go ahead and do on nt. We're going to do on nth end. So now we're going to do the end of our swipe basically, and we're going to leave that at 0. Okay, so this is the opposite. So first we did on touch start, now we're doing on touch end. Okay. The other thing we're going to do is, so basically the point of this is we're triggering if the player is actually swiping. So on this touch end, we're going to add a condition onto this to determine if it's actually a swipe or if it's just a touch. So you're going to right click on this green arrow and we're going to add another condition to this. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to touch and we want to compare touch speed, which is right here. And we want the touch speed. We can leave this at 0 and we want it to be greater than or equal to 20. Okay. So basically, by adding this condition that the touch speed has to be greater than 20, basically what we're going to do is we're setting the values at start. Here we're going to set the values at end, and we're going to compare them to see if it's a horizontal or a vertical swipe. But by adding this condition, this means that this event won't trigger if the player just taps the screen. Because we say that the touch speed has to be greater than 20, that's our way of telling the computer we want it to be an actual swipe. Because if there's no speed to it or the speed's really low, the player probably isn't trying to swipe, they're probably just tapping the screen. So we want to make sure it's a legitimate swipe. That's what that means. Okay. Then we're going to add an event similar to this, but it's going to be for the end coordinates. So we're adding an action right here, and we're going to do salmon, set value. Helps if I type in correctly. Set value, and we're going to do touch x end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do x touch absolute x. Okay. And then we're going to do the same thing. So this should just say touch x end to touch dot absolute x. And then we're going to do the same here. We're going to do touch y end. So salmon, set value. And we've got touch y end to touch dot absolute y. Okay. Now, one of the more common mistakes when people salmons don't move, it's because they don't have the right variables here. So make sure these top two, it says start on both of these, and make sure these two say end. Okay. So basically what happens is we initiate a touch. It's going to set the x and y coordinates of the start variables to what the current x and y are. Then this here says when we end the swipe, as long as the speed is greater than 0, we're going to take the salmon's end variables and attach them to the actual x and y variables of the cursor. Okay? All right. So then what we're going to do is we are going to add some local variables in here because now once we've calculated the X and Y start and end points, we need to calculate the difference of them to see if it's a vertical or a horizontal swipe. I know, and this is how detailed you have to be with the computer, right? So basically, rather than there's no like direct way to just say if it's a vertical or horizontal swipe. So what we have to do is the player has to actually make a swipe. The computer actually has to like compare the X and Y values and see which is greater. So if we see that the X start and end is a greater value than the Y, so like that means it was a longer horizontal swipe. If the Y values when you subtract them is greater, then it means it's more of a vertical swipe. So we have to manually like tell the computer to do that calculation. Okay. So I know like this is going to seem really complicated. So if you don't fully understand this, that's fine. As long as you understand like at least the purpose of what this is doing, even if you don't fully understand every step of it. Okay. So we are going to add a local variable and we're going to do it right here. So you're going to right click on event 4 on this green arrow. We're going to add a local variable, which is right down here. So I went to add at the top and then local variable at the bottom. Okay. So the two variables, we're going to make something called xdiff and ydiff. And diff is short for difference. So we're going to make one here that just is called xdiff. I might do a capital X on this. And it can be 0. And then we're going to add another local variable. So right click on event 4 again, add local variable. We're going to call this one ydiff. Okay, so the difference between a local variable and a global variable, this global variable carries throughout the entire game through every event sheet. So we can always refer to this. These local variables can only be used on this event sheet and only if it's a sub-event of the game over 0 because they are sub-evented to that. The reason why programmers do local variables like this is because this is something that we don't want being used the entire time. It makes our game more efficient. If we made these global variables, like they would always be there and always be working, and we don't want that, we only want it working in this instance. So it's just an efficiency thing, okay? All right. So then what we're going to do is now that we have this xdiff and ydiff local number, now we can add a couple more actions to this. So we're going to add an action down here onto 4, okay? And then we're going to do system, and we're going to set the value of one of the local variables. So we're going to do set value right here, okay? And we are going to set xdiff, and then what we're going to do for the value is we're going to subtract the salmon's touch X end from its touch X start, okay? So we'll do salmon first, press enter on it or double click it, dot touch X end. You want to do the end first, okay? And then we're going to do minus, so just type a minus sign. You're going to do salmon dot touch X start, okay? It's very important that this is touch X end minus touch X start, okay? Then we're going to do the same event for the Y. So let's do it again. So we're going to add an action for system. Okay, and then we are going to set value. Now we're going to do ydiff. Okay, and then we're going to do salmon dot touch y end minus salmon dot touch y start. Okay, and it should look like this. Now this is another common mistake, so you have to make sure this here, this line has all X's on it. So make sure this is an X, this is an X, and this is an X. And then make sure it's end minus the start. And same thing here, this should be ydiff, touch y, and then it should be end minus the start, okay? So here's what's happening. We are initiating the swipe. It's setting the X and Y coordinates of the salmon to whatever that position is when we start. Then if our speed is greater than 20, which we're swiping, it means, it's going to take the X and Y ends and line them up with the X and Y coordinates where we end. Then what this is it's going to subtract our ending coordinate for the X from the starting coordinate, and it's going to subtract the end Y coordinate from the start coordinate, and it's going to set the X diff and Y difference to that. And then what we're going to be programming is if the X difference is greater than the Y difference, that means it's a horizontal swipe. If the Y difference is greater than the X difference, then it's going to be a vertical swipe. So this is the setup just to tell the computer a vertical or horizontal swipe, okay? All right, so now on event 4, which is right here, we are going to add a sub-event to this, okay? So we're gonna right-click and do add sub-event. Make sure you're right-clicking on that green arrow there. Okay, we're gonna do system, compare two values, okay? And basically what we are going to do is we want to know if the xdiff is greater than the ydiff. Now here's the thing. Depending on where you're swiping and where you're locating, your xdiff or your ydiff could be a negative number. So what we want to do is we want to actually take the absolute value of these, because it shouldn't matter if I'm going negative or positive. If it's negative, but it's a bigger number, we still want that to be a horizontal swipe, right? So like if my my y diff is only like 1, but my x diff is negative 20, that means I went to the left like 20 pixels, right? Which that's still a horizontal swipe. So in order for this equation to work, we need the absolute value, which means we just chop the negative off. So to make this an absolute value, you're going to put parentheses around this xdiff up here. And in front of it, you're going to type ABS. And that's just short for absolute value. And you want to do the same thing on ydiff. So you could do ABS if you want first. It doesn't really matter. Oh, shoot, it got rid of everything. That's fine. ABS and then parentheses and then ydiff. Okay, like this. Okay, so it should look like that. So basically we're saying we want the absolute value of the x diff to be greater than the absolute value of the y diff, and that's going to mean horizontal swipe, okay? So what we're going to do to remember that this means horizontal swipe, because you might not remember that, especially if you don't fully understand this, you're just going to right click on the event here, and what you're going to do is you're going to go add and then comment. And whatever event you right click on when you make a comment, it's going to put the comment right above it. So we're going to add a comment, and our comment is going to be horizontal swipe. And the comment, you're not actually coding for this. It's literally like just writing yourself a note. So you don't have to follow any rules here. Just type it out in whatever way makes sense to you. You want to put spaces, do proper grammar, all that stuff. But now this is a quick reminder to me that this little chunk here means we're detecting a horizontal swipe. Okay. All right. Then if we want to get a vertical swipe, we could say if the absolute value of the y diff is greater than the x diff, right? But we want to do something a little safer than that, because we could have a very rare situation where they're equal and then the computer doesn't know what to do. So just to be safer, to cover any other situation, instead of just saying that the x diff is less than y diff or saying y diff is greater than, we're just going to do else. So basically, because basically if it's not a horizontal swipe, then it has to be a vertical, right? So what we're going to do is on this event 5, you're going to right click, look at where my cursor is, this empty spot here. You're going to right click right here, and we're going to go add and then else. So the else should go right below it, and it should be even with it, just like this, okay? So if that else is even with it, that means that's going to cover any other situation than a horizontal swipe, which then would be a vertical swipe. So we're going to make a note of that right here. So you can just right click this, and you can add a comment. So we'll add a comment, and then we're going to put vertical swipe, just like that. And now I have the comment there, so I know that this else is my vertical swipe. So then what we're going to do, and we're going to leave this later, so this vertical stuff we'll get to later, but now we have it separated out where we know where our horizontal swiping is and where our vertical swiping is. Okay, so now we're going to go back to event 5. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make a sub event onto this. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to add a sub event. Okay, and then we're going to do system, and we're going to do compare variable. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to say that xdiff is greater than 0. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put a comment on this. So you're going to right click on this, xdiff is greater than 0. And we're going to say that this means move right. Okay. So now basically we're kind of breaking this down. We're kind of breaking this down into really small chunks. So this is going to remind you of that think like a programmer activity back at the beginning of the semester, where we're really breaking down a simple task into very, very small steps. So first we have to determine if it's a horizontal swipe, right? And then if it is a horizontal swipe, we have to figure out if it's left or right. So if the X diff is greater than 0, that means we're moving to the right. That means it's going to move right. And then we'll have another event that determines if it's moving left. Okay. All right. So then what we're going to do is when we move right, we have to think of what the salmon needs to do here. So if you remember back here, the salmon's going to be here on lane 2. So if the salmon moves to the right, it's going to go to lane 3. So we have to change the salmon's lane to 3. That's one thing that we're going to have to do. So on this X diff greater than 0, and we're going to add 1 to lane, just like this. Okay, so then if the lane was 2, it's going to go up to 3. If the lane was 1, it's going to go up to 2. Okay. Then, if you remember, our salmon has bullet behavior, but it has no speed. So what we're going to do is we're going to add speed so that the salmon will actually move. So let's add an action for the salmon, and we're going to say type in speed. We want to do the second set speed. You want to change the bullet speed. Okay, and we're going to set the bullet speed to 350. Then we're going to click done. Okay, so we set bullet speed to 350. And then we have to change the angle that the salmon is moving. So we're going to add an action for salmon, and then we're going to type in angle of motion. Okay, and it should give you this right here. We want the angle of motion to be 0. 0 degrees moves to the right. So if you remember, I have an angle of motion chart in the resources you can look at for bullet angles, but 0 moves it to the right. So basically we're saying if the salmon is moving right, which we put a comment on there, we add 1 to lane, we set the bullet speed to 350 so it actually has movement speed, and then we set the angle to 0 so that it actually will move to the right. Okay, so we've got all of that in. Now there's one other thing we have to do. We have to put a condition on here. And so here's the trick. We want it so that if the salmon's already in lane 3, we don't want to be able to move right and go off the screen, okay? So we're basically going to add a condition that says the salmon will only move right if the lane does not equal 3. Because if the lane is 3, that means the salmon is right here. So we're just going to add a condition. So go to this X diff greater than 0. Right-click the empty space. We're going to add another condition, and we're going to do salmon. We're going to compare instance variable. So right here, compare instance variable. And we want lane not equal to 3. Okay. So this is basically saying that if the X diff is greater than 0, and as long as the salmon's lane is not 3, we're going to move to the right and add a lane to the salmon. Okay. All right. Now we want to do all of the same stuff, but we want to move left. So it's going to be very similar to this. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of this. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to grab this left part here and just click it once. So it should highlight all of this should be orange if you click right where my cursor is. Then what you're going to do is you're going to hold control and you're going to click on the comment. So that's all highlighted. Okay. Now with all of that highlighted, I could right click it and do copy. I can right click it again and I can do paste. And you'll see I pasted it right below it right here. The other thing you could have done is while it is highlighted, so I would click it, hold control. You could hold control and click and drag it right above or below it. That would work too. Okay, but you just want to copy it on here. Then we're just going to edit all of these pieces to make it go left. So I'm going to edit the comment. And I'm going to change this to left. Okay. And then if the X diff is greater than 0 is right, so for left, it's going to have to be less than 0. Okay. Now, if you think back to here, the time we do not want the salmon to move left is if the salmon's on this side. And this is lane 1. So we don't want to move left if the lane is 1. So we're going to make a requirement that lane cannot equal 1. So we're going to edit that. So we edited this to less than. We changed this to 1 instead of 3. Then If we're moving left, we want to subtract from the lane, right? Because if I'm in lane 2 and I move left, I want his lane to be 1. So we're going to change this to subtract. So I have to double click it. I have to press the back button, and then I have to type in subtract. And we'll do subtract from, and then I can click done. So we have to subtract 1 from lane. The bullet speed is fine. We still want it to be 350, but we want the angle of motion to go to the left. To go to the left, the angle of motion should be 180. So we'll do 180 just like that. Okay, so hopefully your code looks like mine. The alignment has to be perfect. So notice, like anytime there's an indent, so see how this horizontal is indented inside of this? This is indented inside of this. Every time you indent, that piece of code is harder to access because it means everything above it has to be true. So in order for this to trigger, the game over has to be 0. In order for this to trigger, the game over has to be 0 and the touch speed has to be greater than 20. Okay. And then for this to trigger, all the previous things had to be true. So you have to make sure you're indenting properly and don't indent too much because you don't want to make code inaccessible. So just make sure it looks like this. So see how the move right and move left are even with each other. Okay. All right. So we've got that. We got that part done. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add, so we're going to go all the way back up to this game over is 0. And just so that you guys know, anything with a sub event, you'll see a little black arrow next to it. Like we can minimize it. So I could minimize this game over 0 and just hide all of that stuff, but it's all still there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize this game over 0 for a quick second. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add another sub event to this game over 0. Okay. Well, we can have it open. That's fine. So just make sure that you have this part highlighted right here. We're going to right click on that. And we're going to add sub event. Sub event right here. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do, so basically what we're going to work on now is we're going to make the salmon stop when it is actually on the lane. So this is going to be a little bit trickier. So we're going to do system and we're going to do something called pick by comparison. Right here, pick by comparison. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the lane marker. Okay. And then what we want to do is we want the lane marker dot lane number, okay, to equal salmon dot lane. Salmon dot lane. Okay. All right, done. So basically, and so this event should be right down here, should be event 9. Okay. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to detect when the lane marker matches the salmon's lane. And it should always match if we've coded it correctly. So you see here, like the salmon's on 2 and the lane number of that lane marker is 2. When I move to the right, we said add 1 to lane to lane. So salmon's lane becomes 3 and this lane marker is already marked as 3. So basically what we're going to do is basically when the salmon touches it and they're equal, we're going to make the salmon stop. And that's what this event is starting to do here. Okay. All right. So we've got that. So then what we're going to do is we're going to add a sub event to this. So let's add sub event. So it's a sub event onto this new event we just did right here. So my cursor's right here on event 9, right click, add sub event. Okay. And then we're going to do system is between values, which is this one right here. Okay. And then the value we're going to look at is salmon.x. Now this one, just bear with me as we put this in, and then I'll kind of explain what it means when we're done. Okay. Sorry, top value should be salmon dot. Okay. And then the lower bound is going to be lane marker lane number. No, sorry. It's lane marker dot x, my bad, -6. And then the upper bound is lane marker dot x +6. So you can retype it or you could copy this if you wanted to. I'll just type it quick. So lane marker dot x +6. Okay, done. So basically what this code means right here is we're practicing when the salmon hits the lane marker. And what's going to happen is when we drag, it's going to have a speed of 350. So we don't want it to be that the salmon has to be right on that point. So we're basically, by doing this plus and minus 6 here, that's giving us a 6 pixel range that can hit and still make it be true. So this minus 6 and plus 6 is just a safety net, because if we don't have this, what happens, the way it works is the salmon might be moving so fast that it kind of glitches over the lane marker and he just keeps going. So this is just giving us like a 6 pixel cushion to help us determine if he's on the lane marker or not. Okay, so then the action here is where we're actually going to stop the salmon from moving. So we're going to add an action for salmon, and then we're going to do set value, not set value, sorry, don't do that. Ignore that. Add action for salmon, and what we want to do is we want to set the bullet speed. So just go ahead and type in bullet, and then you can find set speed here. We're going to set the bullet speed to 0. So that's how we stop the salmon, is we just set his bullet speed to 0. Okay. So basically what happens is we pick the lane marker where the marker will equal the salmon's lane. So it's basically when they collide and they match up. Then as long as the lane marker is within 6 pixels of the salmon, we'll set the salmon speed to 0. That's what this means kind of in short. So what we're going to do at this time is I want you to test it and see if it works like mine does. So we're going to press play. Basically, if you click and drag to the right, they should move, and you see he stopped right on the lane. The other thing you need to test is if you swipe to the right, he shouldn't move because the lane marker should not equal 3, right? And we can go to the left, and you should stop on the lanes. Okay, and if I try going to the left, I can't do it. So if your salmon is not working right now, a couple of things to look at. Um, you want to make sure that these little lane markers down here actually have the right lane number set for their instance variables. So you want to make sure that this marker is at 3, this marker is at 2, and this one's at 1. And then you want to just make sure, review this code and make sure that this all looks correct, just like what you're seeing on the screen. Okay. All right. So we're going to keep going. We're almost done. Like I said, this is a long one, but we're getting there. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we are going to do the up and down. So the salmon's going to be able to jump over things and dive under things. So we're going to get some of that. Now, what's going to happen is we don't have the animations in yet. So we're going to temporarily put text on that's going to tell us if we're jumping or not. And obviously, yes, we could just put the animations in now and do it that way. But part of this is teaching you as a programmer, as a developer, you might add temporary things to your games just to help you debug more quickly or look at things. And that's definitely an okay thing to do. So I want you to go back to your game layout. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go on the HUD layer. So go ahead and highlight the HUD layer, and we're going to make a new text object. So go ahead and just double click, and we're going to make a text box. Okay. And what we can do is we can call it text test. So it's just going to be a testing text box. Okay. And then just click on the screen to add it on there. It's going to look something like this. Okay. And if you want to make it bigger and easier to see, you can edit this as you please. So what I might do is I might change this to like test, so I know I'm testing it. And then maybe I make the text box a little bit bigger so I increase the size so it's easier to see. If I want to be really fancy, I could do horizontal center so I know it's like right in the middle. But I'm just gonna have this big testing test box here. Okay. I know it's kind of a lot to say, right? All right. So then what we're gonna do is we're just gonna make this text change to show us if we're jumping or not. So let's go back to our event sheet. We're going to go up to event 5, which should be the else event. So let me see. Sub event to the else. Actually, it's not 5. Let me go back here. So it's actually event 8. So I want it here. Yes, because it's on the vertical swipe. So ignore the number I just said. We want to find the vertical swipe here. Okay, and we're going to add a sub event to it. So let's go ahead and right click. We're going to add a sub event. Okay, and then we're going to do system. And what we're going to do is we are going to compare variable. And we want to compare if the y diff is greater than 0. Or no, yes, less than 0. So this can throw you off a little bit. So y values, so we're doing the jump right now, right? Y values actually get lower as you go higher. So like if I'm doing an upward motion, that's actually lowering the y diff, the y value. So If y diff is less than 0, that's going to be an upward movement, okay? So I've got this y diff is less than 0. We're going to add an action, and we're going to take the text test, okay, and we're going to do set text, okay, and what we're going to do is we are going to make it say jump. So inside the quotation marks, just type in the word jump. And then what I would do is on this y diff less than 0, we're going to right click and add a comment, and we're going to make it say jump. Whoops. And that's good for later on, because later on when we want to put the jumping animations in, we can look at this comment and say, oh, the jumping animations are going to go right here. Okay. All right, and then we're going to do the exact same thing for y diff is greater than 0. So what I could do is I could just right click this right here and I could copy it, and I could right click the same spot and I could paste it and just do that. Or if you just want to type it out again, you could just do another sub event to the else and then type it out manually. But we want system, now we want y diff is greater than 0, which is actually a downward motion because y increases as you move down. And then we're going to set this to, I think in the presentation they say down, but for me it makes sense to say dive because our fish is actually diving under the water. And then I'm going to right click on this y diff greater than 0, and I'm going to add a comment, and I'm going to call it dive. So that way we know that that's when our fish is going to dive. Okay. All right. So now we're going to test it and see if it works. So just make sure it's on the vertical swipe. You have the sub event for jumping, the sub event for diving, and it should look like this. You go ahead and run it, and you can see my text up here. If I go up, see how it changed to jump, and then if I do a down swipe, it went to dive. So that tells me that even though I don't have the animations in yet, that those are working, and then my left and right, I can visually see that as well. Okay. So this is just a good reference because anytime you just want to see something, like maybe you want to know like if a variable is changing, you can make a text object and just tie it to the variable every tick, and then you'll have that visual just to help you see that as a programmer. Okay. All right. So that part is good there. All right. So now what we're going to do is this is kind of the last thing we're going to do. It's going to be a couple of steps, but what we're going to do is we're going to get these land objects moving downward. Okay. And this will be, once we do that, then we'll stop for section 2. Like I said, this was a longer one. So if you're pausing or whatever, just pause when you need to. You can stop for the day when you need to, and just make sure you remember where you're at in the video and come back to it, okay? All right, so we're going to add a global variable to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click down here in the empty space, add a global variable. We're going to call it game speed, okay? And the game speed is going to be 350. Now, the reason why we might make a variable for game speed is because all of the obstacles and background objects are going to be moving downward at a certain speed. And rather than just giving them a default speed, we're always going to have them tied to whatever the game speed is. So that way, if I want the game to get harder, by simply adjusting the game speed variable, it's going to change the values of all of the objects that are tied to that. So basically, by controlling the one variable, I can control the speed of the entire game. So that's the whole point of making the game speed global variable. Okay. Now, I don't believe we have an on-start of layout yet. So I'm going to minimize the touch controls and just get that out of my way. I'm going to make a new event, and it's going to be system on start of layout. Okay. And I like my on start to be at the top. So I'm going to grab it by the green arrow. So I'm going to click it to highlight it and then drag it above touch controls just like that. So I've got my on start of layout at the top. And then we have to set the variables to a certain way. So we're going to add an action, and I'm going to do system, set value. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to set game over to 0. And I want to add another action, and I'm going to do system set value. And I want to set game speed to 350. Okay. Now you might ask, game over already equals 0. Game speed already equals 350. Why would I have to do it again on start of layout? The reason why we have to do it here is because if you've already played the game and you get a game over and you restart, we need to reset the variables. Because if I end the game and my game speed's 475, If I don't do this event here, the next time I play, the game speed is going to be 475, and I'm going to be starting off way harder than I should. So this is basically resetting the variables so that the game will start fresh. Okay, so that's what that means. Okay, now let's go back to our land objects. We're going to add bullet behavior to these because these land objects are actually going to move. Now, if you remember, they're actually locked right here. So what we can do is we can just grab them from the project window. So I'm going to click on land left, just single click it, go over to the left in the properties window, and we're going to click behaviors right here where my cursor is wiggling around. We're going to add a behavior and we're going to give it bullet. So BUL, there we go. Okay. I got bullet on my land left. Okay, and I'm going to give a bullet to my land right. So I'm going to go to land right, add a behavior. We'll get bullet here. Perfect. Okay. Now we have to change some settings on these. So I'm going to go to land left again. Now I should have a bunch of bullet settings right here, right? Um, so what it's going to do, actually, no, we don't have to. Yeah, we do have to do a setting. So what we have to do, because yeah, I think we actually have to click on them on the layout. You see when I click it from the project window, it's saying no instances here. It's not actually linking to the one on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to unlock my background really quick. Or wait, they're not on the background, right? Oh yeah, they are. Yep, they are. Okay. So I'm going to just unlock my background, click on my land left, and the one setting we want to change is the set angle has to be turned off. And that's super important that you turn that off. Otherwise, it's going to try changing the angle of motion, the actual way that it's moving to match the angle it's facing, and that's not always going to be true. So you want to turn that off. We're going to go to same thing on land right, so just highlight that really quick and make sure that that set angle is turned off. And I think that's all we have to do there. So then you can relock your background layer. Okay. Now we're going to go back to the event sheet and we're going to add some more actions to this on start of layout. So basically what we want to do is when the game starts, we want to make sure that those land objects are moving down and that they're setting, that they're aligning to the game speed. So we're going to add an action for land left. And what we're going to do is we're going to set angle of motion. So just type in angle, and then you want angle of motion right here. And the angle of motion is going to be 90. 90 is going to go straight down. Okay. So we want the land left's angle to be 90 and we want land right. So go ahead and do another action for land right. We're going to do angle to 90. Now, when you're working with very similarly named objects, here's something I want you to watch out for. Notice that in between, like all of these conditions and actions, that there's like, I can get this little icon here and I can actually move this around and I can have more or less room in areas. So a really common thing that I see is it might be like this, okay? Where like there's not enough room to tell if this is land right or land left. And that can be a problem because these could both say land left and then your land right isn't doing the right thing. So what I would do is adjust these bars so that you can fully read the object names at a bare minimum. Okay. And same with this, like these can all be adjusted. Like you can give more or less room to each area, but make sure you utilize that. And you always want to be able to see the full names of your objects. If you can't, I would shift that over. Okay. All right. So then we have to do the same thing for game speed. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an action for land left and we're going to set bullet speed. So if I just type in bullet, we'll do set speed here under bullet. And we want to set the speed to game speed. And if you type in game speed, it should pop up here. So basically, whatever the game speed is, it's going to just make it align with that right away. Do the same thing for land right. So we're going to do speed, bullet speed to game speed. Okay. So the event should look like that. Okay, that's our on start of layout ready to go. All right, so we did all that. So let's go ahead and test it out and see what happens. So you can click the play button at the top. So you can see that they should move down and just kind of go off the page. Now, if that isn't working correctly, like I said, make sure that the lefts and rights are accurate here. Make sure that these are at 90. And the big one is the set angle has to be turned off in the properties window. Okay, so just make sure over here, you can't see it now because I don't have it selected, but there will be a set angle that has to be turned off for the left land and the right land. Oh, we are almost done. Okay, very last step here. So let's make a new group for land movement. So we're going to right click. We're going to add a group. And it's going to be called land movement. Okay, so there it is. Um, what we're going to do basically, so here's what's going to happen. We're going to make it so that when the land objects go off the screen, we're going to make it so it spawns a new land object right behind it. And then we're going to make it so the one in the front gets destroyed. And basically, we're going to create like a train of these land objects that are going to connect and reproduce behind each other. And this is why I'm going to unlock this really quick. This is why your origin and your image points are so important. Okay. So here, remember we put the origin in the bottom right. So basically, the origin is going to trigger right when it hits the bottom of the layout. When that triggers and it hits the bottom of the layout, then what we're going to do is we're going to spawn a new land object behind it at image point one. And when it spawns that new one at image point one, it's going to do it by the origin. So what's going to happen is the origin, which is the bottom right of the new object, is going to touch the image point of the old object, which is going to line up here perfectly. So if after we do this step, if they're spawning and they're getting crooked or they're moving slightly to the right or to the left, it means your origins and image points aren't lined up. So that's crucial here. Okay, you'll see it in a second. So let's go ahead and add an event to the land movement group. System, compare two values. Okay. Um, what we want to do is we want to know if land left, y. So we're going to do everything for land left first, and then we'll copy it and do the right side. So we're going to do land left dot y is greater than or equal to. And then for the second part, we're going to do something called viewport bottom, which is this right here. Okay. Viewport bottom just means it's the bottom of the window. Okay. So viewport bottom in this instance is going to be the bottom of the layout. So basically, we're going to say when land left dot y, which is that origin point, is basically lower. That's what greater than or equal to, because y's increase as you go down. Okay. Is if it's greater than viewport bottom, that's going to be right when the origin leaves the bottom of the screen. That's what this means. Okay. Whoops. Why didn't that work? Oh, you know what? I remember this being an issue. So let me see. Window. I'm trying to remember how we do this. Viewport bottom. Hold on. Let me do viewport bottom. And then we might have to add a piece to this. Let me do this. Let me put a 0 in here. There we go. Okay. So they don't give it to you by default, but you have to put the parentheses and the 0 on there. Okay. So just go ahead and do that. So if land left y is greater than or equal to viewport bottom 0, like that. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we are basically going to have the land left spawn another land left behind it. So we're going to add an action for land left. We're going to do spawn another object. It's going to spawn another land left. And it's going to be on layer 0. And you notice that these layers are numbered. So it's going to be on the background layer because that's number 0. And then we want to do image point 1. That's crucial. Okay. So basically, if land left y is greater than viewport bottom, it's going to spawn one. Now, the issue is there's no other restriction on this. So the moment this hits, it's going to infinitely spawn a bunch of land lefts and crash your game. So we have to put a restriction on this. So we're going to add a condition here. So let's add another condition. And we have to say that land left count has to equal 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to do system compare two values. And what we want is we want land left dot count. That means it's going to count how many land lefts are on the screen. Has to equal 1. So that way there can only be one on the screen and it will spawn another one. And as soon as the second one spawns, then this won't trigger anymore because there'll be more than one on the screen. Okay. Then let's add another event to land movement. Basically, when a new land is created, we have to make sure it's going down and it's set to game speed. So we have to kind of do that again. So we're going to say land left on created. Okay. We're going to add an action for land left. And we're going to set speed. We're going to set it to game speed. Okay. And we're going to add an action for land left. And we're going to set angle of motion to 90. Now, technically, I think we should set the angle before the game speed. Let me just double check. Yeah, let's do the angle before the game speed. Because what technically could happen, so when it initially spawns, the angle of motion is going to be 0. So it's going to try to move to the right. So if we set the game speed first, it might like go 1 pixel to the right before it moves down, and we don't want that. So let's make sure the angle is 90 before we set it to the speed. So make sure it's in this order. Okay. Then the last part is we want to destroy that land left eventually. So basically what's going to happen is the land left is moving down. Basically, as soon as that origin passes this line, it's going to spawn a new one behind it, right? So then there's 2 on the screen. Then basically once this moves fully off the screen so that it's no longer visible, we're going to make it get destroyed. So in order to do that, we're going to add another event to land movement. And we're basically going to compare when it's the entire length of its body off the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to do land left. We're going to do compare y. Okay, we want to compare its y coordinate. And basically, if the y is greater than land left dot height times 2. So for times, you're going to do shift 8, which does that star symbol. Okay, and we're going to do times 2. So land left dot height times 2. So basically, when the y coordinate is at the point that it would be double its height, is basically would determine when it's completely off the screen and we want to get rid of it. Okay. Then what you're going to do is you're going to add an action for land left and you're going to destroy it. Okay. So the first one should get destroyed before the second one leaves the layout. And then when the second one leaves, it's going to spawn a new one behind it. So basically, if you have this code here, we should have an infinite loop. And it's really important that you make sure everything we put here, make sure it says land left, like all these have to be left. Really common mistake is one of these somewhere says right, and it's going to throw the whole thing off. So I'm going to run it quick. So the land left, if you see here, if you did it correctly, the left side should be infinitely spawning and should never stop. Okay. So now what we want to do is the same thing for right. The easiest thing to do is to just copy all this code and change all of these land lefts to land right. So what you're going to do is click on one of these events on the left side, hold down Control, highlight all of the other events. Okay. When they're all highlighted like this, you're going to right click on one of them. You're going to copy, right click and paste. Now this whole set here needs to be land right. So here's what you do. Anywhere you see a land left, you're going to right click it. You're going to do replace object. And then it says, what do you want to replace land left with? Land right. So see it change that to land right. But we have to do that on all of them. This one here, replace object. Land left with land right. Here's another one. Right click, replace object. Land left with land right. Replace object here. Okay, so I'm just going to go through and do this quickly. Replace object. This one, replace object. Okay, and then this one here, replace object. Now this one, oh, it did. It actually did the code part for me as well. Okay, and then here's another land left. Replace object with land right. Okay, so you want to make sure at the second set that we just did, 18, 19, and 20 online, all of these should say land right. And you can run the game really quickly and you'll know if you did it wrong. But you can see mine are both infinitely spawning. All right, guys, that's finally the end of section 2. I know it was a long one. Thanks for going through and getting it done. This game's a lot more complicated. This is only section 2 of 8, so we still got a ways to go. All right, so tune in for the next one, which will be section 3.